Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is Dave Yorck, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War. And sir, thank you very much for being with us.
I appreciate it.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
Quedlinburg, Germany, 1943.
And your family has a very difficult but interesting story from the end of World War II.
Right. Basically, we were German Catholics that were against Adolf Hitler, and my uncle was in the plot to kill Hitler, Operation Valkyrie, July 20th, 1944, which was unsuccessful. And my uncle Peter Yorck was hung by the Nazis on August 8, 1944, in Berlin. My mother was American, my father was German. He was in a German tank unit outside Rome, and he got off his tank and went to the Vatican, and the Pope hid him for 2 weeks, and then he worked for the OSS, which is the forerunner of CIA. Then we came to America, Port Washington, Long Island, in 1950.
What was your uncle's role in Operation Valkyrie?
He was under Colonel Stauffenberg. Stauffen was the guy who planted the bomb that exploded, and he was administrator. He was an attorney and a lieutenant, and he was part of the group that when they assassinated Hitler and got rid of the Gestapo, they're going to start a new government, which is basically aristocratic, not bringing back the Kaiser, but it was more upper-class aristocratic Germans wanted to take over.
So your family came to America.
Right. And
you settled in Long Island, you said?
Yeah, Port Washington, Long Island, and played football, went to Colgate, joined Marine Corps PLC before there was a lot of anti-war stuff. So 2 summers in 63 and 65, I went to training at Quantico, Virginia as an enlisted Marine to see what life was like as an enlisted Marine, which is a great experience because it shows you, you're leading enlisted Marines that you want to know how they live. So I came back in the best shape of my life. I played football, I wrestled, and then I went right off to Vietnam in 1967.
What was it about the Marine Corps that appealed to you most?
The uniform. Yeah, the uniform and the reputation. Yeah.
What was training like?
Tough. I mean, I was in good shape. At my prime, I was 6'3", 216. But we had to do like 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, and run 3 miles in 6 minutes a mile, which is trucking. So I was in really good shape, and most of the Marines were in excellent shape.
Your first tour was in 67. So what were your responsibilities in your unit prior to deploying?
I went right over. In other words, I had no stateside duty. I went right over to Vietnam and then picked up a company down by Hue City. And unfortunately, we went to a hill called Con Thien, and we're just sitting on the hill being bombarded by the North Vietnamese. So I think during that time frame, we had 267 Americans killed, and we didn't kill that many Vietnamese communists. But we were sort of sitting ducks, and that was pretty traumatic. We were just sitting on the hill, and it was right by the DMZ. We could see North Vietnam with our telescopes. So we were just trying to make a barrier between North and South Vietnam. It was called the McNamara Line, and it was unsuccessful. And so finally in 68, they forgot about the line, and they just had constant fighting between the Marines and the North Vietnamese army. There were no civilians in that area, which is good. So we never had problems, running with civilians or killing civilians and stuff like that. It was just Marines against the North Vietnamese army, which was a very good army.
What was combat like compared to what you expected it to be?
Tough. The biggest thing was your friends getting killed. You're not fighting, everyone thinks you're fighting for the American flag or the Marine Corps. You're not. You're fighting for the guys next to you. They had one of the saddest things in my life. I had a corpsman, which is a Navy hospital corpsman who was assigned to me. You sit next to me all the time. We were in a foxhole, and we got hit one night, and he got shot 17 times, and I carried his body back. And I kept in touch with his mother for 42 years. And during that time frame, during my 2.5 years in Vietnam, I lost 18 guys killed. We killed a lot of enemy, but losing those Americans was pretty tough. And I did have PTSD for quite a while afterwards.
How did that affect you as you look back now? How did that affect you as you went forward with that tour?
It was like Charles Dickens has a book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Tales of Two Cities. And that's the way I felt about it. It was some of the best of times in that the comradeship you never find out in the civilian world. After I retired from the Marine Corps in 1991, I worked for Xerox. And I found out in the business world, you really couldn't trust too many people. But in the military and combat, you've got to trust the people around you. And we still have reunions once every 2 or 3 years. And I had a reunion up in Oceanside yesterday that I hadn't seen some of the guys for 30 years. And it was nice.
What unit were you with?
First unit was 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. Then I was XO of Kilo 3-4. Then I was the commanding officer of Lima 3-4 in 1969.
So as you just mentioned, 3 different tours here. Let's talk about the second one, because you volunteered and then you were platoon commander in 1968. How did your role change? What were you doing specifically there?
Platoon commander on the chain of thing is about 30 people. Company commander is about 200 people. Battalion commander, which I did before I went to Desert Storm, is about 700 to 1,000 people. So I had about 238 Marines, about 5 corpsmen with us. And we were in 1969, we were fighting north of Van de Griff, fighting against the North Vietnamese. And that was Second World War. Pitched, we'd take a hill, they'd take a hill. So for about 2 months, it was heavy hand-to-hand combat, and it was pretty gruesome.
What's that like? Give me a little more detail, as much as you feel comfortable with.
Well, as a commanding officer, you've got to set the role. So you've got to pretend that you're not afraid of the situation. You've got to set the example. For instance, in the field, people didn't want to shave. Well, the Marine Corps said everyone has to shave in the field. So guys had to shave in the field, had to wear their uniform somewhat squared away, have some discipline. We never saluted in the field. We always went by our last name. So we never would be Captain Yorck or Lieutenant Smith or Sergeant so-and-so. It would be Yorck, Smith, Hazeman, so on and so forth. But it was a tight unit. And I'm very proud of my time in 1969. That was the highlight of my younger years in the Marine Corps.
Tell me a little bit more about the missions you would go on. You mentioned the hand-to-hand, but others, first as a platoon commander, what type of...
Well, the platoon commander is the one we talked about in the beginning. We were just sitting on a hill, Con Thien, and that was sort of a hopeless situation. It was like being on Dien Bien Phu, where the French was in 1954. We were just taking incoming rockets from the North Vietnamese, would send out patrol and a couple of tanks. They'd bracket us with their artillery. We wouldn't accomplish anything. We'd go back to the hill. That lasted... My unit was there for about 3 months, and then we did patrolling around the area. Does that answer your question?
It does. And where were you on those patrols, and what kind of engagements did you get involved with?
Sure. Out of the 30 people in a platoon, platoon commander is probably number 10, and then you have your senior sergeant who's in the back of the unit, making sure that stragglers don't get lost, so on and so forth. So you majority of the time in Vietnam, by the mountains and the jungle, you'd walk Indian file, one behind each other and stuff like that. And we would set up ambushes at night. Interesting thing is the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese did most of their fighting at night. And we would patrol during the daytimes, which in retrospect was a mistake. We should have done more fighting at night.
How hard was it to fight? I mean, it's you couldn't see, from what I understand, just more than a few feet through the vegetation during the day. How did you engage during the night?
Well, you'd have a thing called, let's say you're making a perimeter, like the old cowboy movies that you're in a circle. So what you would do in the perimeter throughout the night, you throw out hand grenades or fire your rifle, because they'd sneak up on you. We'd try to take the high ground. At night, we'd try to be on a little hill, so we could hear them coming up, but they were very good. They would crawl on their bellies. And a couple of times they penetrated our positions, and that was when all hell broke loose, when they get through the lines. with a small amount of people, 4 to 8 people. But they kill our people when they get through the lines.
Were they easy to repel? Were they tough fighters?
Yeah, very good fight, very disciplined. They were in uniform. It wasn't the stereotype. You look at the BC in black pajamas, and these guys had pith helmets. Their shoes were made by Michelin rubber, and they had green olive uniforms. And they were being supplied at the time by Russia and China. And we'll go on later on about my feelings on how this turned the situation around that Russia and China, the powers they are, because we couldn't stop them in Vietnam.
As time went on, did you develop tactics that helped you sniff out where they were? You mentioned throwing the grenades and that sort of thing to kind of smoke them out of their positions, but as time went on, was it easier to figure out their tactics, or were they pretty crafty at...
They'd do two things in this area. They'd be in bunkers, which would be well camouflaged, so we would walk and then all of a sudden bump into their bunker, or they would, in the middle of the night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, they'd come and attack our positions. So that's how the war really went.
And how quickly could you scramble to...
We were ready. We'd have 2 people in a foxhole. One person was supposed to be awake and the other person could sleep. You'd maybe get 4 hours to sleep a night. But in retrospect, for instance, my tours were 13 months, and the actual hard fighting, if you put it together, my first tour was maybe half the time was hard fighting. The rest of the time was pretty boring. Second tour, hard fighting was about 3/4 of the time, and then the rest was patrolling, and we'd get up at like 6:30 in the morning, we'd patrol till 4 and be exhausted, and we'd dig in our foxholes and then set for the night, stuff like that. We'd go out for 30 days.
By the end of that 30 days, what's going through your mind? And physically, you must be completely exhausted.
Well, you're trying to take care of your men. That's the big thing. I think I was in one of the better shapes. I mean, I dropped from 216 down to 186. But the guys did a great job. Some of the young Marines had a tough time, weren't in the best of shape, and they had heat exhaustion, and because you didn't wash, there was how you'd wash when it would rain. That's how you'd wash. You wouldn't go back to the rear. That's another thing. What happened in Vietnam is that for one person fighting, there were 7 people in the rear pushing paper and smoking dope. And so it's called the tooth-to-tail ratio. So it was a very ineffective war. We had the same amount of people fighting as the French had during their war, which ended in 1954.
Mr. Yorck, let's pause right there. We'll come right back for our next segment here on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, and we're speaking with U.S. Marine Corps veteran and Vietnam War veteran Dave Yorck. We'll be right back. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel David Yorck. He's a veteran of the Vietnam War, 3 different tours. He says 2.5. We'll count him as 3, though, I think, working his way up to company commander. And of course, as you build up with each of these tours, you're responsible for more and more people. Talk about how that responsibility grew and how it maybe changed how you made decisions.
It's a great question. Basically, you get, as a company commander, you see the big picture. So I had 3 platoon commanders that had 30 men each. Then I had a machine gun unit. And very important is that I had a senior staff NCO, Sergeant Major Lee Bradley. He's African American. And we've been friends since 1969. He's here in San Diego. And he's the best Marine I ever met in my life. A lot of times when you talk to an officer, they say, oh, General so-and-so. Sergeant Major Lee Bradley was the best Marine, the best leader I've ever met. And I'm proud that he's a friend of mine for all these years.
What made him such a good leader?
We were starting to have racial problems in Vietnam. Some of the blacks didn't want to go out to the field because of the situation in the States. And he said, Captain, you take care of the tactics, I'll take care of the discipline. And he did.
How did he deal with it?
He was 6'5", about 240, and he didn't put up with any bullshit. But he was professional.
And he was specifically right beneath you?
Yeah, he was a gunny at the time. but he was an outstanding Marine. He became the first Marine Division Sergeant Major, and he wanted to become the first black Sergeant Major in the Marine Corps, which is a big honor. And he just missed that. But I just talked to him like 3 days ago. Nice.
What was your experience with the man? Obviously, he was taking care of some of the problems, but...
Well, my name was the Beast. And basically, I know I'm a history buff, and I know a lot about the German Army because my family has been in the German Army for 300 years. And the German Army was good because the staff NCOs were excellent, and the men feared the staff NCOs more than they feared the enemy. So you want to have respect. You don't want to be friends with the troops, but they have to respect you. You have to be fair, and that's the way I ran it. So my nickname behind my back was the Beast. So I don't think today it would fly, but 50 years ago it did.
It was effective then. That's what mattered. Between your second and third tours, you spent time in Cuba. Tell me a little bit about that assignment.
I went to Guantanamo, Cuba, and then later on in life, I became an analyst for a Defense Intelligence Agency on Cuba. And at one time in 1980, we were thinking about invading Cuba. We did not do that, but I learned a lot about Castro. He comes from an upper-class background. He was an illegitimate son of a doctor. He wore a watch on each arm. One was Cuban time and one was Moscow time. And I really liked that type of stuff. So after I came back from Vietnam in 1970, I went to Columbia University and majored in political science, international affairs.
Tell me a little bit more about the almost invasion of Cuba in 1980. I don't think most people know that.
Yeah, it was called the Mariel. They had all the immigrants coming over, and what he was doing, all his prisoners had their tongues tattooed. So they'd have, if you were, let's say, a rapist, you'd have 2 dots on your tongue. If you were a murderer, you have 3. So he emptied out all his prisons, and they had good Cubans, but then also the criminal element came to Miami. And so there was huge influx of Cubans that came to Florida, and at one time America was considering amphibious invasion to get rid of Castro.
The Mariel boat lift is what you're referring to, and yeah, I've certainly heard of that. I didn't know that there was a potential military response in the works. Yeah. So how far along did that get?
Well, we have war efforts against every country in the world. A lot of people don't know that. We had war efforts against Canada, and Mexico and stuff like that. So there's plans at the Department of Defense for all contingencies, and you have to have that. I think the realistic thing today is Russia, but my fear is China is beating us economically, and that's the rising sun is going to be China.
Tell me a little bit more about your work in general at the DIA.
I did a study on how would you do an amphibious invasion of Cuba and the order of battle.
This is the last question I'm going to ask about the potential amphibious assault on Cuba. But our last guest in here was literally in his plane during the Cuban Missile Crisis on the deck of the carrier getting ready to go.
Wow.
When it comes to the amphibious approach, was it just in the idea stage, or was it actually advancing?
It was just the idea stage. I think finally what happened is they did bring some planes to Cuba to take the refugees out, and the rest of the refugees came by ship from Havana to southern Florida. So the deal was getting the Cubans out, and they have a situation, if you're a Cuban refugee, you come here illegally, but if you get 1 foot on American soil, you're given amnesty. You can stay in America. No other group, South Americans don't get that. Ukrainians don't get that. I think the policy now is going to change. But I'm a legal immigrant. My wife's a legal immigrant. And we made it in America. So I love America. I think you can work hard, and you have to be lucky, and you can make it in America.
Colonel, when we come back, we'll talk more about your time in the CIA and your overall reflections on your service in Vietnam, as well as more from your nearly 30-year career in the United States Marine Corps. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Our guest is retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel David Yorck. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel David Yorck. He's a veteran of the Vietnam War, but he's also spent time with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and as we're about to learn, the Central Intelligence Agency. And so, Colonel, how did you get connected to the CIA, and what kind of work did you do there?
Well, it was very interesting. After I finished my tour in 1969, the Marines were being pulled out. It was under the Nixon administration. They decided to downsize the military presence. But the CIA had an operation called Operation Phoenix, and that was run out of Saigon. And there was a Colonel Terrence Allen who was in charge, a Marine Corps colonel. And he liked me, and he said, Yorck, would you like to come down and be an advisor to the South Vietnamese police / reconnaissance unit? And I said, sure. And flew down to Saigon from North Vietnam. Vietnam at that time, South Vietnam was 700 miles long, a population of 18 million people. Now Vietnam has a population of 80 million people. So the growth is unbelievable. So we went down there, and he said, the province I have is Bin Long province, and that's about 100 miles north of Saigon, and it borders on the Cambodian border, and that's where the supplies are coming in from the North Vietnamese, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as you've heard, was not in Vietnam. It was in Laos and Cambodia, and then it would bring supplies down the trail to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. So I said, I'd love to do it. So we flew out there, and it was an old rubber plantation. It was a Michelin rubber plantation that was still operative. The French had paid bribes to the Viet Cong so they wouldn't burn down the rubber trees. And so doing my whole tour there, the French had Vietnamese working on the rubber trees. And then at the end of the war in 1975, there were Michelin plantations, and the rubber was being used to make tires that was taken over by the communist government. So I thought it was a pretty interesting situation. I had 35 Vietnamese, and about 10 Montagnards were the mountain people in the hills, and then about 10 Cambodians. And we would get our orders to locate and neutralize suspected communists. And I was living right next to the CIA headquarters in Bin Long, close to An Loc. And it was a great relationship. I had a lot of respect for the Vietnamese. I happened to be Roman Catholic. And I thought the Vietnam War had something a lot of people didn't know about. It was a religious war. The Catholics in South Vietnam ran the country. President Diem's brother was the bishop of Saigon, and most of the officers and the government employees were Catholics, the people who sided with the French. So I'd say about 20% of the population was Catholic, and the rest was Buddhist, or they have Ao Dai and Ho Ho, which is a special, like Mormonism in the United States. So it was a great relationship. I worked well with the Vietnamese. In fact, the district chief played tennis, and I was a terrible tennis player when I played with him, once a week, and intentionally lost the game, so he could win the bottle of scotch. But we would get basically target lists of suspected Vietnamese tax collectors. The communists had a hidden government. During the daytime, the South Vietnamese ran the show, but at night, again, the communists had their own situation, and they taxed the people, and that's how they were successful.
So how did you target these communists?
We'd get a list. It's interesting. This is the beginning of CIA, beginning of IBM computers, and we'd get a target list. They have huge central computers in Saigon, and the information is as good as it can get. So sometimes we were a little bit suspected, whether political animosities between people, and so someone would say he's a communist or not. But we'd get a target list of, let's say, 10, 15 people a week, and then we'd go out, arrest them, turn them over to the South Vietnamese for interrogation. They either come back to the town being cleared, or they'd go to prison. We did not kill anybody. We did not do any atrocities and stuff like that. So,
how many were you able to get?
205 months. So I did very well.
And how long did that operation last?
5 months.
Did they ever divulge much?
Yes. In fact, this is interesting. Most of our intelligence we got in the Vietnam War was from Catholic priests. There was a Catholic, large Catholic population in North Vietnam, and the Catholic priests were obviously against the communists. And the Catholic priests fed a lot of information to CIA.
What did you do after that?
Then I came back to the States, got accepted into Columbia University, and went to School of International Affairs in Columbia in 1970, doing the student riots, which was pretty tough.
You're still active duty at this point, right?
Yeah, I was. Then I went to reserve for 2 years, and then I came back in. So I grew up in Long Island, so Columbia was just down the street, from where I lived, and it was a real shock to me. I was a dorm advisor at Columbia. About 1/3 of the kids were straight, 1/3 of the kids were gay, 1/3 of the kids were communists, and it was a big shock for me.
And so once you went back on active duty, I'm guessing that was when
72.
72. So part of that time we'd already talked about with the DIA. What else did your final nearly 20 years?
Sure. I was very good in recruiting. So I did recruiting in Kansas City, and then I went to jungle warfare school in Panama, went to mountain warfare training in Colorado, and then I went on a tour, 6 months on a ship. It went from North Carolina to England, Scotland, Denmark, Germany, and Paris, and that was a lot of fun. I went through 2 marriages. I had 3 daughters, and got remarried in 80 to an Iranian Muslim, a great wife. We were married 42 years. We have 2 sons. One went to Naval Academy, and the second boy went to Princeton. And I demanded that all my kids and all my sons-in-law went to the military, and they all did. So I'm very proud of America, and I think all Americans should serve in the military. What I saw at the end of my life, we became upper middle class, and what we're seeing is that only the poor people are going to the military, and I don't think that's fair.
I want to touch for a moment. You mentioned you married your wife who was from Iran in 1980, which is obviously in the middle of the hostage crisis.
Exactly,
so
she worked for the American Navy in Iran, but she still got the repercussions when she came to America and married me.
Does she still have family there?
Interesting story. She's really from Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan, a lot of people don't know, it's Baku. And that's the big oil center in the Central Asia, and that's where Hitler was trying to go. Instead of going to Stalingrad, he should have gone down and tried to take Baku, and that would have secured his oil supply for the war. But he didn't do it. And so the people from Baku speak a Turkish language, and it was invaded by Russia in 1917. Communists took over, and so my wife's father, Mohammed Dadashi, left Azerbaijan and moved to northern Iran. So he was really, my wife's family is really Azerbaijani.
You mentioned a moment ago that you insisted that your sons and sons-in-law went to military academies. What do you believe that experience and however long they served active duty benefits them?
Well, one story I want to, not from an officer's perspective, but my son-in-law, who I appreciate the most, is Sergeant Clint Kruger. And Clint is bigger than me, 6'4", maybe 240, and he was a sergeant in the Marine Corps Infantry. And when he finished his tour in the Marine Corps, he said, I'm not interested in college, I want to become an electrician. So he became an electrician. Now he owns his own company in Minneapolis. He's a multimillionaire, and he's just a great son-in-law. So what I'm saying, you don't have to go to college to be successful in life. You can have a good trade, plumber, electrician, doing something. So a lot of the parents push their kids to become, for instance, lawyer. The average lawyer in California makes $45,000 a year, but they have the title, they're a lawyer. So I think you have to look at the whole education system in America. And now that we're going computerized, I think learning work computers and coding, so on and so forth, is very important. The other boys, Peter, who went to Princeton, played football. He was 101st Airborne and 75th Rangers. A lot of combat. My other son, David, went to Naval Academy. He's up for lieutenant colonel. And then my daughter married a great guy, Brian Thompson, who started as an enlisted man, E1, and made it up to warrant officer, and now lieutenant, and he's up for major or lieutenant commander in the Navy. So I'm pretty proud of all my family. I've got 11 grandchildren.
How do you feel your time in the service changed you, and in particular, your time in combat?
I think with my background, combat is what I expected. That's why I joined the Marine Corps. It was, like I said before, it's the best of times and it was the worst of times. I'm still friends with guys I knew in the 60s. We have reunions. We have a big reunion coming up this year. I try to help a lot of veterans get disability for post-traumatic stress and now prostate cancer, which comes from Agent Orange. It's the central theme of my life. Afterwards, I worked 28 years for Xerox, but compared to the Marine Corps was a better experience, I think.
You mentioned the physical effects of war outside of combat, being Agent Orange,
right,
and its effect on you and others. There was also the changing attitude in America about the war. Did you experience any of that animosity personally?
No, because I was a big guy. No one would give me shit to my face, but behind my back, I'm sure they did. No one spat on me here. But the family was split. I had a sister who's passed since then, and she was very leftish, and she was against the war, but we were civil to each other. And I had another brother who was going to join the Marine Corps. He didn't. So the family was split, just like what's happening today with, Trump, Biden, so on and so forth. But I tell the kids today, what's happening now isn't as bad as it was in 1970. And one of the things my father told me, which I think is great, he said America goes left and then to the right, then ends up in the center. So that's the hope, that America is going to go back to the center and make progress for all Americans, because I saw the situation with discrimination towards the blacks. The military at that time was one of the best places for blacks to get a job because they were promoted on merit. And a lot of times in the civilian world, they weren't in the 60s. They didn't even have the chance to get decent jobs.
Last couple of minutes here, Colonel. I know it's been a little more than 30 years since you retired, but you've remained extraordinarily active with the military community, and including holding a number of roles with the Military Officers Association of America. I know a lot of our listeners and viewers are familiar with that, but for those who might not be, tell us a little bit about it and specifically your role with it.
It's called Military Officers Association of America. It's headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. It's got 400 chapters. And basically what we try to do is lobby for benefits for veterans and surviving spouses, which I think is very worthwhile. I belong to other organizations like VFW, which is for combat veterans, American Legion, and Marine Corps reconnaissance units. But I'm the president of Hidden Valley up in Escondido. I was the president of MOA in all of California, which is about 20,000 veterans. And we do a lot of good work. And right now we're also getting involved with supplying food, money, and clothing for Afghani refugees and for the Ukrainian refugees that are coming through Mexico. Should be here shortly. So then we also help people getting their VA disability and their spouses. Once a veteran dies of a condition, let's say prostate cancer that was caused by Agent Orange, the wife would get a small amount of money, which is probably $1,400 a month, and free medical for the rest of her life. So we want to make sure those veterans and the spouses are taken care of.
Colonel Yorck, you've talked about so many different ways that you're proud of your service, but what are you most proud of when you think about those nearly 30 years in uniform?
The people I met. I was just a small cog in the machine of, at that time, probably 250,000 Marines, but the friendship I made with all ranks and stuff like that, and I am a people person, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. We thank you very much for your many years of service to our country, both on the battlefield and then in the intelligence world as well. It's a varied career and one that has done a great service to our country. And it's obvious that your younger generations in your family are contributing very much as well. So we thank you for your family's legacy of service, and we thank you for your time today very much.
Well, I thank you and your group for doing this. This is a real welcome home that you guys are doing this. God bless America.
Lieutenant Colonel David Yorck, U.S. Marine Corps retired, also did some work with the CIA, as we've talked about, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's a veteran of the Vietnam War also. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles.
Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.